Going to Rushanara now, please. Rushanara, do you have your sound on? Ah, yeah, you're muted.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to have you all in this committee. I wanted to start off with a question about your own individual legacies and an opportunity for you to set us all straight about your own legacies. Do you, each of you, feel you did enough to invest in our healthcare system and primary care and social care on your watch in order to have prepared us and made our system, healthcare system and care system, resilient enough to cope with this crisis? And I think I'm going to go in order, starting with Alistair, followed by George, followed by Philip.
Well, you know, I'm hesitant about writing my own obituary. I'll let other people do that. Or alternatively, you could buy my book, which is still on sale from all good booksellers, if you'd like to do that. On the health service, you know, I'll just make this point. I think, you know, successive governments have spent a lot of money on the health service. We spent a lot of money on it. We increased taxation specifically to do it. Gordon Brown did that at the beginning of this century. What I would say is that all of us, in one way or another, have always put off the day when we know full well that because of demographic change, the bill for the NHS is going to go up, and it's going to go up again. None of us have solved the care problem, which of course is an adjunct to the health service. And I think after this, people will say, never again we're going to get a situation where it becomes so obvious that the thing is being funded just in time. There's got to be resilience. We can't have a situation where there isn't protection equipment, where we can't do testing. We wouldn't be having this discussion if we were sitting in Korea or maybe Germany at this stage. They were just better prepared. And, you know, it's a point I think George made earlier on, that perhaps people will realize there are some things that governments can do that we as individuals can't do. So rather, I think, than go back over who did what and who might have done more, you know, over the last, 20, 30 years or so, I think we should look and ask ourselves where we are just now. And I'm sorry to add to the bill that we have been mounting up this afternoon, but the health service is another area where the government is going to have to spend some money.
Yeah,
and staff as well, of course.
Thank you very much, George. The Health Committee warned witnesses in 2011 that the Lansley reform was going to be a big diversion in terms of preparedness for when a pandemic strikes. Professor Pickles was documented recently in her prescient warnings, and about £800 million has been taken out of support to local authorities in dealing with healthcare in recent years. Do you think that that was a mistake, with the benefit of hindsight in terms of the recent years on your watch and your successors' watch?
Who's that for?
Sorry, George, that was for you, I think.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Well, look, I think if you look at, you know, obviously we're still in the middle of this pandemic. You know, I think our NHS, you know, has not been overwhelmed. I mean, the central fear we had in March was that Britain would face a situation that was faced in northern Italy, where people would present to the hospital, want an intensive care bed or a ventilator, and not get it because the NHS couldn't cope. There wasn't enough beds or ventilators. That was the big central fear. That big fear has not happened. And sometimes in politics, you have to sort of spot the absence of war, the argument we're not having, the fact we're talking, and I'm going to come on to care homes, the fact we're not talking about the NHS being overwhelmed, I think is, you know, an enormous credit to the people who run the NHS.
Absolutely.
I think if you're, and by the way, all the pandemic planning that I saw, which was, you know, pandemic planning for a flu rather than a coronavirus, and maybe there was an error there that the world made, but the assumed you could rapidly ramp up NHS capacity, and those Nightingale hospitals was an example of that. You could do that, and you can do that. I think where Britain has fallen down compared to some other countries like Germany, you know, we have to look at, you know, obviously there'll be questions about the government and how quickly it went into the lockdown and so on, but I think we actually have to look at the structure of our NHS. I think it is a very centralised bureaucracy. You know, other countries have a much more regional approach to it.
My question was about whether, on your watch, each of you Could you have done more to build resilience in our NHS and care system? Because I think, as Alistair and others you've already mentioned, we need to look at what we do going forward and what we can learn, and what our current Treasury can do, building on what your achievements have been.
Well, I think the NHS
needs to be improved.
Yeah, well, the NHS is too centralised. I think when we do the inquiries into what happened on testing and PPE, it will not be just because some health minister didn't put a call into some company in China to get some PPE. It's because, we were too slow in the procurement, too centralised. And I think we should take a leaf out of what has happened in Manchester, where it's the one part of England where the NHS is devolved. And it, all the agencies I came across in government, it is the most centralised, and by the way, the most difficult to penetrate for the elected government of the day. And then on care homes, look, none of us solved the care home crisis for a very simple reason. There are two ways to pay for better care in our country. You can either take the assets that people have, i.e. their home, get them to sell their home and pay for care. That is very politically painful to do, and let me finish. Or you can increase general taxation and provide a national care service, which would be very expensive to do, maybe the right solution, but then you go and make your argument for another couple of pence on income tax to pay for it. And those are the two options.
I'm gonna get on to Philip, because I've got a couple of more questions, and Chair's gonna shut me down soon.
So the problem about resilience is it's easy to say after an event, we should have had more resilience against this event. We're all talking about ventilators. Did we have enough ventilators? But if it had been a different type of virus, it wouldn't have been ventilators we needed. It would have been something else. Yeah. So it's not just about budgets. It's about the way in which you manage resilience. We have a national risk register, which lists literally hundreds of risks that the country is facing and is regularly reviewed to try to ensure that we have a proper approach to resilience. But there is a balance. We would equally be mocked, and governments regularly are mocked, when they stockpile large amount of stuff which never gets used, gets to the end of its life and has to be destroyed. So we clearly didn't get it right in relation to resilience around PPE and ventilators. But hindsight is a wonderful thing, and I've no doubt at all that the process in the Cabinet Office of looking at how we manage resilience will be reviewed afterwards. I just want to say something about NHS budget. We put a very large amount of additional money into the NHS in 2018, and of course there were plenty of people around saying thank you very much, but we need much more. There is a capacity in the NHS, and you can expand it, but you need to expand it with care, because if you just pour money into the top of a system like the NHS, you risk creating sector-specific inflation where you don't get more healthcare, you just get better, more profitable drug companies. And I don't think that's what we want to do. We want to expand the system carefully and methodically.
Some would argue it should have been done over the decade, not towards the end after considerable pressure. I just wanted to get onto the point about exit strategy. Others have touched on it. You've all highlighted the fact that the interdependence between health and getting the economy kick-started. What do you think, building on what you've already said, what else do we need to do, does our Treasury and other bits of government need to do in terms of organising itself so that the exit strategy doesn't, in effect, mean a trade-off here in the UK? And then given the international nature of this pandemic, but also markets, what can we learn from both the financial crisis and the infrastructure that was set up and the global cooperation that existed? Many would argue that's missing at the moment, and global leadership is lacking. And this pandemic and this crisis needs it more than ever before. Can you reflect on some of those issues and concerns very quickly, please? Got one more after that.
You're asking me to carry on?
Yeah, please, quickly. I'm just going to get out.
Okay. I mean, look, business needs guidance from the government about how we reactivate the economy. What are the assumptions we have to make? Are we living with COVID? Do we have to rebuild our infrastructure around a 2-meter separation distance? Is that really sustainable? Is there really a scientific base for 2 meters? For example, redesigning office space around a standard of 1 metre or 1.5 metres would be a radically different proposition from redesigning it around 2 metres. Now, I don't have access to the scientific advice, so I don't know whether we've really tested whether we can make that more user-friendly without unacceptably compromising the health position.
Alistair, just on the picking up on the international side, any reflections on that? You're muted.
Sorry, you're muted, Alistair, I think.
So the international cooperation that we had in 2009 was absolutely essential to get the global economy working again, and especially for a country like ours, which is a trading country. The fact that you had communist China and Republican-led United States and other countries in the G20 all meeting in Washington at that time, and in London, of course, in 2009, it made a massive difference. And unfortunately, at the moment, as you know, the two biggest economies, are barely speaking to each other at the moment, and the prospect of the G20, which happens to exist, it's not perfect, but it happens to exist. It's not able to function at the moment. So yes, it is important. And equally, if you're dealing with something like a pandemic, by very nature, it doesn't stop at political boundaries. And the cooperation we need, if only there'd been more cooperation when this thing first started, and perhaps we'd have started our lockdown a lot earlier, we will certainly need to work together to look at what we might do in the future, because the chances are the next pandemic will be different. So that, but the cooperation is absolutely critical.
George, you've touched on a number of social consequences of earlier on. You mentioned social consequences. We see what's happening in the US. We see the inequalities in our own country and the effects on poorer people, frontline workers, Black and Asian people, and the differential death rates. In terms of our exit strategy, do you think we should be investing more in those groups who need to be employed so that we don't have these radical imbalances that are exacerbated on top of what they faced over the last decade? For instance, young people, 1 million young people are likely to be unemployed. Should there be a job guarantee, some sort of intermediate labour market, as was introduced during the financial crisis, to help young people? Because the risk is civil unrest if we don't make sure we give hope to those who are likely to face unemployment.
I'm sorry to interject. George, can you give a very short answer to this? I'm just aware of the number of people still to come in. Thank you. And then we'll move on. Thank you.
Yeah, no, sorry. I certainly think we should have a very comprehensive job program. I would say is, I think in this country and elsewhere, there's going to be an ongoing battle, which this crisis has accentuated, not removed, between those who want, essentially a more progressive approach with government getting involved and helping people and a big role for the private sector, and those who want to kind of close borders and whatever. And this crisis has given both fuel for their causes.
Thank you.